If you play chess, your favorite grandmaster might have used a few terms that you don't quite understand.
Fuck you, Levy. Why didn't you...
And that's because we don't understand the language of chess, which is of course is very natural to them. But for us, it can be a little bit difficult to understand at times. So today I'm going to be covering some of the more useful terms. I'm not going to be covering the easiest ones like pawn structure or double pawns or isolated pawns or castling. These are very basic words, and even though you don't even play chess, you might already know them because some of them are just logically making sense if you just look at the word. So I don't really see a reason of covering it. But instead, I am going to be covering words like tactics, tempo, outpost, and blockade. Of course, these terms are easier to understand if we look at an example. So let's say we play on the black side of the board. Our first word is tempo, and as we can see, our opponents tried to beat us using the scholar's mate. Of course, we're not stupid, so we just put our knight on f6 and our pawn on d5, preventing his light square bishop to get here. In this position, you have the opportunity to win tempo on your opponent by moving your bishop up to attack his queen. That forces him to move his queen that he's already moved once, making him unable to keep developing his pieces like his light square bishop, and that way you win tempo. But you can also win tempo on attacking other pieces that he's already developed. For instance, now you attack his knight. Now you still win tempo because he's forced to retreat. Now this gives you a big lead in development as you see on the board. You have 3 pawns moved already and 2 minor pieces developed, with a third coming along the way with the black square bishop. And that is why tempo is very important, and whenever you can see that you can win tempo on your opponent, you should do it. The next term we're going to be looking at is tactics, and this is a term that I've heard being used very often, but I've never really understood what it actually meant. Now, the way that I translate this term into something that I can understand is that it's a move or a sequence of moves that eventually leads to you either gaining a material advantage, a pawn structure advantage, or just a space advantage. And I've actually come up with an example that helps us understand this term. So if we look at the board, we can see that it's white's turn to move. And moving the queen to d4 both attacks the knight that is undefended and threatens checkmate because you have the bishop on b2. Now, the only sensible way that black can respond to this is defending the checkmate. So that forces him to move his knight to f5. Now that allows you to win the knight on b6. Now if we have a look at another example that I had in one of my recent games, it is now my opponent's, the black side's turn to move. He decides to move his knight to g4, threatening the fork that you see on f2. But this is actually not a tactic because the definition of it is that you create so many threats that I can't respond to it, and I can easily respond to this by bringing my queen back. Now he can't move into the fork because I just take his knight. So this is not a tactic because it doesn't result in him getting an advantage. This is just a blunder. Now these next few terms are a lot simpler, and they're also quite similar because they all involve pawns. Our next term is outpost, and it's something that I usually use very actively in the London Opening. Now let's say the black side were to take our knight on e5. Now we retake our knight, and our new knight is now created an outpost. This means that black side cannot threaten or throw this knight out. It will forever stay here because it's not threatened with anything of equal value to trade with. And that means that our knight on e5 will now pressure all these light squares. Our next term is blockade. A blockade is when you prevent your opponent from pushing their pawns. You can do this with knights, bishops, any piece on the board really, also other pawns. Let's look at this example I had recently where black side pushes their g-pawn twice. Now I blockade their movement by going up with my g-pawn once. Now he cannot push this. And let's look at the evaluation bar if he was able to push this. Let's say that I just moved my knight to b3, let's say. And now you can see that he's able to fork me, and just look at the evaluation, it goes almost to even. It's not always this crucial to blockade your opponent's pawns, but as a general rule of thumb, you generally want to blockade your opponent's pawns. Now let's look at our last term, which is complex. And a complex is when you lose either your light square or your black square bishop, and then compensate for that by putting your pawns or remaining pawns in the same color of the bishop you've lost. For instance, as you see in this example, I put a lot of my pawns on the light squares because I've lost my light square bishop. This is something that often occurs in the Caro-Kann. Now, as you can see, I still have a lot of control over the light squares because I put my pawn on the light squares. And that is what I would call a white superiority. So there you have it. And I hope that you've also seen throughout this video that knowing these terms can also work as a general rule of thumb of how you want to play your games and get better positions.
Raindrops are falling on my head, and just like the guy whose feet are too big for his bed, nothing seems to fit. Those raindrops are falling on my head, they keep falling.